In the earliest surviving layers of Greek myth and religious poetry, the story of Persephone begins not as a dramatic underworld tale, but as a structured genealogical account of divine power, recorded most clearly in the tradition associated with Hesiod's Theogony, composed around the 8th century BC. What emerges from this early framework is not a fairy tale or symbolic myth in the later literary sense, but a carefully ordered cosmology where every deity has a role, a lineage, and a place within the hierarchy of existence. Within this structure, Persephone, known in early Greek as Kore, meaning the maiden, is introduced as the daughter of two major Olympian figures, Demeter and Zeus. This parentage is not incidental detail. It defines her entire theological significance in ancient Greek thought. Demeter represents the earth's fertility, agriculture, grain, and the sustaining cycles of harvest, while Zeus embodies cosmic order, authority, weather, and the overarching structure of divine governance. Persephone, therefore, is born at the intersection of two fundamental forces, the productive earth and the ordering sky. In Hesiod's genealogical worldview, this union is part of a broader pattern in which Zeus extends his influence through relationships with various goddesses, each union producing divine figures who govern specific domains of nature and human experience. The text does not present emotional motivations in modern narrative terms. Instead, it frames divine relationships as structural necessities in the organization of the cosmos. Persephone's birth is thus positioned as part of the establishment of cosmic balance, rather than as a personal story. At this early stage, Persephone is not yet associated with the underworld. She exists primarily as Kore, the maiden, a concept deeply embedded in ancient Greek religious and cultural life. The term Kore is not merely descriptive. It represents a sacred archetype. It refers to the state of transition between childhood and adulthood, a phase associated with fertility, potential growth, and renewal. In agricultural societies, this stage mirrored the life cycle of crops, the seed, the sprout, and the emerging plant before harvest. As such, Kore was not simply a young woman. She was a symbol of becoming itself. This identity appears repeatedly in early Greek inscriptions and votive dedications, where worshippers refer simply to Kore without further explanation. The absence of additional naming suggests that the identity was already universally understood within religious practice. In several early sanctuaries, archaeologists have uncovered offerings dedicated to Kore that predate fully developed mythological narratives, indicating that the religious concept existed independently of the later abduction story. A key textual reinforcement of this early identity comes from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, composed between the 7th and 6th centuries BC. This hymn provides one of the most complete early accounts of Persephone's role as Kore and her relationship with Demeter. In this tradition, Persephone is depicted as deeply beloved by her mother, accompanying her in a world defined by agricultural harmony and seasonal stability. The hymn emphasizes their bond not as symbolic abstraction, but as lived divine relationship. Kore is portrayed as inseparable from Demeter's domain, often surrounded by companions who are also symbolic representations of nature and fertility. The narrative situates her in a meadow, gathering flowers, a scene that is not incidental but deeply ritualized in ancient Greek thought. Meadows in mythic geography often represent liminal spaces, areas between cultivated land and wilderness, between civilization and the unknown. This early portrayal is reinforced by archaeological evidence from sites across the Greek world, particularly Eleusis, Aegina, and regions of the Peloponnese. Excavations in these areas have uncovered votive figurines, ceramic offerings, and temple foundations that predate classical mythological literature. Many of these artifacts depict youthful female figures in floral or agricultural contexts, often without identifying inscriptions, suggesting that their meaning was culturally understood as representations of Kore or similar maiden deities. At Eleusis in particular, the continuity of religious practice is especially significant. The site later became the center of the Eleusinian mysteries, one of the most important religious traditions in the ancient Mediterranean world. However, the earliest layers of construction and ritual activity at Eleusis indicate a pre-literary religious system focused on fertility, agricultural cycles, and the worship of mother and daughter divine figures. These early practices likely formed the foundation upon which later mythological interpretations were built. The association between Demeter and Kore is further reinforced by Linear B tablets discovered at Mycenaean archaeological sites such as Pylos and Knossos. These administrative records, dating to approximately 1450 to 1200 BC, reference offerings to female deities associated with grain, fertility, and seasonal rituals. While the language of these tablets predates classical Greek, many scholars interpret certain names and titles as early forms of the divine pair later known as Demeter and Persephone. The continuity between Mycenaean religious practice and later Greek myth suggests a deep historical layering rather than a sudden invention of narrative. These records show that agricultural festivals and offerings were structured around seasonal cycles, reinforcing the idea that divine female figures govern the processes of planting, growth, and harvest. In this system, the maiden figure, later Persephone, was not yet defined by descent into the underworld, but by her role in the renewal of life. This early religious framework reflects a broader pattern across the ancient Mediterranean, where pre-Olympian fertility goddesses often embodied both generative and cyclical forces. These traditions frequently emphasized female divine power associated with the Earth's productivity and the rhythms of life and death. In this context, Kore represents not only a daughter figure, but a cosmic principle of emergence and transition. As Greek religious thought evolved, these early concepts began to merge with emerging Olympian theology, gradually integrating older Earth-centered traditions into the hierarchical system governed by Zeus. This integration did not erase older beliefs, but transformed them, embedding them within new mythological structures. It is within this evolving religious environment that Persephone's identity begins to take shape as both Kore and the daughter of Demeter, a figure whose significance is rooted in agricultural cycles, divine lineage, and the deep symbolic relationship between earth, sky, and human survival. At this stage of the tradition, there is still no descent into the underworld, no abduction narrative, and no annual return. Those elements belong to later layers of mythological development. What exists instead is a foundational religious understanding that life, growth, and fertility are governed by divine forces embodied in a mother and her maiden daughter, whose relationship mirrors the cycles of nature itself. And from this foundation, the later, more dramatic narratives would eventually emerge, transforming Kore from a symbol of seasonal potential into one of the most complex figures in all of ancient mythology. As Greek religious tradition develops beyond its earliest genealogical stage, the figure of Kore begins to shift from symbolic maiden of fertility into the center of one of the most important mythological narratives in the ancient world, the story of her disappearance and the transformation of the natural order that follows. This development is most fully preserved in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which becomes the foundational text for how ancient Greeks understood not only Persephone's fate, but the origin of seasonal change itself. In this expanded tradition, the peaceful image of Kore gathering flowers in a meadow becomes the moment of transition between two cosmic states. The meadow itself is not a random location, but a carefully constructed sacred landscape. Ancient sources describe it as a place of extraordinary abundance, filled with flowers that bloom outside normal seasonal patterns. Narcissus, violet, crocus, rose, and iris are all said to grow there simultaneously, creating an environment that defies natural order. This abnormal fertility signals to ancient audiences that the space is liminal, positioned between the world of the living and the hidden structures beneath it. It is in this setting that Persephone, still identified as Kore, becomes separated from her companions. The hymn describes her gathering flowers with a group of divine attendants, figures often interpreted as Oceanid nymphs, daughters of the great river encircling the world. Their presence reinforces the idea that Persephone is still fully embedded in the natural and surface world, not yet marked for transformation. Among the flowers in the meadow, one stands out with deliberate significance: the narcissus. Ancient tradition describes it not as an ordinary plant, but as a flower created with divine intent. It is said to possess an overwhelming beauty and an almost supernatural fragrance that draws attention away from everything else. In symbolic terms, it represents attraction that conceals danger, beauty that masks disruption, and the threshold between innocence and irreversible change. When Persephone reaches for the flower, the narrative shifts abruptly. The ground beneath her opens, not as a gradual descent, but as a sudden rupture in the earth itself. This moment introduces one of the central figures of later Greek mythology, Hades, who emerges from the chasm in a chariot drawn by immortal horses. The hymn emphasizes the violence of the moment. Persephone is not persuaded or willingly guided. She is seized and taken downward while calling out for help. Her voice is described as reaching distant mountains and even the sea, yet no god intervenes. The only witness capable of seeing the full event is Helios, the sun, whose position in the sky allows him to observe all actions on the surface of the earth. This detail becomes crucial in the theological structure of the myth. Helios functions as the witness who cannot intervene, establishing that divine knowledge does not necessarily equal divine action. When Demeter later begins her search, it is Helios who ultimately reveals the truth of Persephone's fate. The abduction itself is not framed in purely emotional terms in the earliest versions, but in cosmic terms. It is presented as an event that reorders relationships between divine domains: the upper world governed by Zeus, the agricultural surface governed by Demeter, and the underworld governed by Hades. Each realm is stable on its own, but Persephone's movement between them destabilizes the entire structure. After her disappearance, the narrative shifts to Demeter's response. Demeter immediately begins a search that is described as total and relentless. She abandons Olympus and assumes a mortal-like form of wandering, traveling across the earth in search of her daughter. Ancient accounts emphasize that she refuses divine nourishment during this period, neither consuming nectar nor ambrosia, which symbolizes her withdrawal from her own divine function. Her search is not symbolic in tone, but geographical and expansive. She moves across mountains, rivers, and cities, questioning every being she encounters. This wandering establishes a key theme in the myth. Even divine authority is subject to loss, ignorance, and uncertainty. Eventually, through Helios, Demeter learns the truth. Hades has taken Persephone with the permission of Zeus. This revelation introduces one of the most complex theological tensions in Greek mythology, because it positions the highest authority of the Olympian order as indirectly responsible for the rupture of maternal bonds. Zeus is therefore not a passive figure in this tradition, but a structural decision-maker whose authority enables the abduction. In some interpretations of the mythic tradition, Zeus's role is presented as diplomatic arrangement between divine domains. In others, it is interpreted as negligence or concealment. The ambiguity is deliberate in ancient sources, reflecting competing theological ideas about divine justice and authority. Following the revelation, Demeter's grief transforms into cosmic crisis. The earth ceases to produce crops, and human survival is threatened. This is one of the most important symbolic elements in the entire tradition. Agricultural failure is directly tied to divine emotional disruption. The myth encodes a worldview in which natural cycles are inseparable from divine states of being. In response, Zeus is forced into negotiation. He cannot simply command Persephone's return because she has already consumed food in the underworld, specifically pomegranate seeds. This act becomes a binding mechanism in ancient legal religious thought. Consumption of underworld food creates an obligation that cannot be undone by force alone. The pomegranate itself carries deep symbolic meaning. It represents fertility, through its many seeds, but also binding attachment through its enclosed structure. Once opened and consumed, it cannot be reversed, mirroring the irreversible nature of certain cosmic transitions. The compromise that follows establishes the foundational explanation for seasonal change in ancient Greek thought. Persephone will spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades and part of the year on the surface with Demeter. Her return corresponds with the revival of agricultural growth, while her descent corresponds with the withdrawal of fertility from the earth. This structure transforms a myth of loss into a cyclical explanation of nature. The Earth's barrenness is not random, but directly connected to the absence of Persephone from the world above. Ancient audiences understood this not as metaphor, but as a real explanation of seasonal agricultural rhythms. Within this framework, Persephone becomes a dual figure. As Kore, she remains the maiden associated with growth and emergence. As queen of the underworld, she becomes a ruler associated with death, transition, and judgment. This dual identity is not a contradiction in ancient thought, but a reflection of the belief that life and death are interconnected phases of a single system. The religious expression of this myth is most fully developed in the Eleusinian tradition associated with the sanctuary at Eleusis, where the Eleusinian mysteries became one of the most important sacred institutions in the ancient Mediterranean world. These rites were closely guarded, and their inner details were not publicly revealed, but ancient descriptions consistently indicate that they centered on themes of loss, search, revelation, and return. Participants in these rituals reenacted aspects of Demeter's search and Persephone's descent, not as theatrical performance, but as sacred experience. The emphasis was on transformation through emotional and spiritual engagement with the myth. The secrecy surrounding the rites suggests that the experience was considered too significant for ordinary disclosure, reinforcing the idea that Persephone's story was not just narrative but lived religious knowledge. Archaeological evidence from Eleusis confirms the long continuity of this tradition. Layers of construction show gradual expansion of ritual spaces over centuries, indicating sustained importance. Votive offerings and inscriptions further confirm that worshippers associated their participation in the mysteries with hope for understanding life after death and the renewal of existence. Outside Eleusis, regional variations of the myth developed across the Greek world. Sicily, in particular, became strongly associated with Persephone's abduction, especially in traditions that placed the event near Lake Pergusa. These local adaptations demonstrate how myth was integrated into geography, with different communities anchoring the cosmic narrative in their own landscapes. Despite these variations, the core structure remains stable across sources. A maiden associated with fertility is taken into the underworld. A mother searches in grief. Divine authority mediates between realms, and a cyclical agreement restores balance between life and death. What emerges from this tradition is not a single story, but a layered system of interpretation, where myth, ritual, agriculture, and cosmology all reinforce each other. Persephone becomes the central figure in this system, embodying both the vulnerability of life and the inevitability of transformation. And from this point in the tradition, later ancient authors begin expanding her role even further, especially in Roman reinterpretations and philosophical readings that will reshape how the underworld itself is understood. From this point in the tradition, the myth of Persephone stops being only a Greek religious explanation of seasonal change and begins expanding into something much larger, shaped by later Greek philosophy, Roman literature, and the gradual reinterpretation of the underworld as both a physical and moral system rather than only a mythic realm. What started as an agricultural cycle story in the Homeric hymn to Demeter slowly becomes a multi-layered narrative that different cultures reshape to reflect their own understanding of power, love, death, and divine order. By the time Roman authors begin retelling the story, Persephone's identity has already shifted significantly. In Roman tradition, she is commonly known as Proserpina, and her story is adapted into a broader literary framework that connects Greek mythology with Roman cultural values. One of the most influential versions appears in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where the tone of the story changes dramatically compared to earlier Greek religious hymns. In Ovid's retelling, the abduction is no longer presented primarily as a theological necessity or cosmic arrangement, but as a visually dramatic and emotionally charged event. The focus shifts toward narrative detail, the beauty of the meadow, the sudden rupture of the earth, the speed of the chariot, and the emotional shock experienced by Persephone as she is carried into the underworld. The Roman perspective emphasizes storytelling, aesthetic experience, and emotional intensity in a way that differs from the more ritual and theological focus of earlier Greek sources. In this version, the god of the underworld, Hades, Pluto, and Roman adaptation, is often portrayed with more psychological depth. Instead of being purely a structural ruler of the dead, he is described with emotional motivation, often interpreted as sudden desire or love at first sight. This shift reflects Roman literary interests in personal emotion and moral ambiguity, rather than purely cosmic function. At the same time, Demeter, Ceres in Roman tradition, becomes even more central as a figure of suffering and persistence. Her grief is expanded into a prolonged narrative of wandering, disguise, and interaction with mortals. In Roman storytelling, her emotional state is not just a divine disruption of agriculture, but also a reflection of universal maternal loss. This makes the myth more accessible to human experience, especially within Roman poetic culture, where gods often mirror human emotional extremes. As the myth spreads further through the Roman world, it begins to absorb philosophical interpretations as well. Stoic and Neoplatonic thinkers reinterpret Persephone's descent not as a literal kidnapping, but as an allegory for the soul's movement between physical existence and spiritual transformation. In these interpretations, the underworld becomes less a geographical location and more a symbolic state of being, representing hidden knowledge, inner transformation, and the inevitable cycle of change. However, even with philosophical reinterpretation, the traditional mythological structure remains intact. Persephone still descends, still returns, and still embodies the cycle of life and death. What changes is how that cycle is understood. In earlier agricultural contexts, it explained crops and seasons. In Roman literary contexts, it becomes emotional drama. In philosophical contexts, it becomes metaphysical structure. Later Latin poets, especially in the late Roman Empire, expand the myth even further into elaborate epic constructions. In works like Claudian's De Raptu Proserpine, the story becomes highly detailed, almost cinematic in its description of cosmic geography, divine councils, and underworld mechanics. The abduction is no longer a brief mythic moment, but an extended epic sequence involving divine negotiation, planetary order, and the political structure of Olympus itself. In these later accounts, Zeus is no longer simply a background authority, but a complex political figure balancing competing divine domains. The decision to allow Persephone's marriage to Hades is framed as part of maintaining cosmic equilibrium. The underworld is no longer merely a place of death, but a necessary administrative region of existence, requiring a queen to maintain order alongside its king. This reframing transforms Persephone from victim to essential participant in the governance of the cosmos. This shift is important because it changes the moral structure of the myth. In earlier Greek religious tradition, the abduction creates imbalance that must be repaired through seasonal compromise. In later Roman-influenced interpretations, the abduction becomes part of a larger system of cosmic administration where every action, even suffering, contributes to universal stability. At the same time, the geographical imagination of the underworld becomes increasingly elaborate. Ancient descriptions of Hades evolve into structured cosmologies with distinct regions, rivers, and boundaries. The underworld is divided into zones such as Tartarus, reserved for punishment, the Elysian fields, reserved for heroic reward, and the neutral realm of ordinary dead souls. Within this system, Persephone's role as queen becomes administrative as well as symbolic, giving her authority over judgment, transition, and the movement of souls. The river systems of the underworld, including Styx, Acheron, and Lethe, are described not only as physical boundaries, but as metaphysical mechanisms governing memory, obligation, and passage between states of existence. The act of crossing into the underworld is therefore not simply spatial, but existential, marking a permanent transformation of identity. Within this expanded cosmology, Persephone becomes a figure who bridges contradictions rather than simply representing one side of them. She is both above and below, both life and death, both daughter and queen. Her dual existence is no longer seen as contradiction, but as necessary balance within a structured universe. The most important religious continuation of this myth remained the Eleusinian tradition centered at Eleusis, where the Eleusinian mysteries continued for centuries even under Roman rule. Initiates participated in secret rituals that symbolically reenacted descent, search, and return, reinforcing the myth not just as story, but as lived spiritual experience. What is significant in these rituals is that they do not preserve the myth as static narrative. Instead, they transform it into an experiential cycle. By the late antique period, philosophical interpretations of the myth become even more dominant. Neoplatonic thinkers interpret Persephone as the soul descending into matter and returning to divine unity. In this framework, Demeter represents higher divine intellect, Hades represents material existence, and Persephone represents the soul moving between them. The myth becomes a map of consciousness rather than a story of divine abduction. Yet despite all reinterpretations, the core structure remains unchanged across more than 1,000 years of tradition. A maiden descends, a mother grieves, a compromise is formed, and the world is permanently shaped by that cycle. What makes the Persephone tradition unique in ancient mythology is precisely this stability beneath transformation. Every culture that inherits the story reshapes its meaning, but none remove its central movement: descent and return, loss and recovery, separation and reunion. And as later ancient writers continue expanding the myth into ever more complex philosophical and literary systems, Persephone remains at the center of one of the most enduring ideas in human storytelling: the belief that destruction and renewal are not opposites, but parts of the same continuous process that governs both the earth and existence itself. As Persephone's place within Greek mythology continued to evolve across centuries of religious practice, philosophical interpretation, and literary retelling, her role as queen of the underworld became increasingly central to how ancient people understood death itself. In the earliest layers of the myth, her descent had explained the seasons and the cycles of agricultural fertility. But over time, especially during the classical and Hellenistic periods, Persephone's presence in the underworld began shaping a much broader vision of existence beyond mortal life. The Greeks did not originally imagine the underworld as a place of simple punishment or reward. Instead, it was understood as an inevitable destination, a vast hidden realm beneath the earth where all human souls eventually traveled regardless of status, wealth, or power. Kings, warriors, slaves, philosophers, and peasants all entered the same domain after death. This idea gave the underworld enormous importance in Greek religious thought because it represented the one reality no mortal could escape. Within this realm, Persephone gradually transformed from abducted maiden into one of the highest authorities governing the dead. Ancient writers increasingly portrayed her seated beside Hades on a dark throne carved from obsidian, ebony, or black stone. Unlike many Olympian gods who ruled through force or spectacle, the underworld rulers governed through inevitability. Their authority came not from conquest, but from the certainty that every living being would eventually enter their domain. Ancient artistic depictions from Greek pottery and temple reliefs reveal this transformation clearly. Early representations of Persephone often show a youthful figure holding flowers, or standing beside Demeter in agricultural scenes. But later works from the 5th and 4th centuries BC begin depicting her crowned, veiled, and enthroned beside Hades, holding scepters, torches, or pomegranates. These symbols carried profound meanings within Greek religion. The torch represented guidance through darkness, not only literal darkness, but the unknown passage between life and death. The scepter symbolized judicial authority, reflecting her role in overseeing the souls of the dead. And the pomegranate remained the most important symbol of all, representing the irreversible bond between worlds. Its countless seeds symbolized fertility and continuity, while its blood-red interior connected it to mortality and sacrifice. As the myth expanded, ancient Greek storytellers increasingly explored Persephone's role as judge and mediator within the underworld. Unlike later religious traditions where judgment often occurs through absolute moral categories, Greek conceptions of the afterlife were more complicated. Souls were evaluated not only by virtue, but by heroic status, loyalty to the gods, and fulfillment of ritual obligations during life. Several major myths involving living heroes entering the underworld place Persephone at the center of critical decisions. One of the most famous examples is the story of Orpheus. According to ancient tradition, Orpheus traveled into the realm of the dead, seeking to recover his wife Eurydice after her death from snakebite. The story became one of the defining myths of grief and devotion in the ancient world. Armed only with his lyre and music, Orpheus descended past the rivers of the underworld, beyond the ferryman Charon, and into the throne hall of Hades and Persephone themselves. Ancient poets describe the scene with extraordinary detail. The shades of the dead fell silent. The eternal punishments of Tartarus paused. Even the Furies, normally incapable of pity, were said to weep at the sound of Orpheus's music. But the emotional center of the story often rests with Persephone. Ancient versions repeatedly emphasize her reaction to Orpheus's plea. As queen of the underworld and a goddess who herself knew separation from loved ones, Persephone understood the agony of loss more intimately than almost any other deity. Her sympathy becomes the key factor that persuades Hades to allow Eurydice's return. This moment is extremely important in understanding how the Greeks viewed Persephone's authority. She is not merely a silent consort beside Hades. She participates directly in judgment and negotiation. Ancient sources make clear that Hades alone does not grant the request. Both rulers must agree. This shared authority demonstrates that Persephone's position in the underworld had become fully institutionalized within Greek religious imagination. Yet the story also reinforces the unbreakable laws governing death. Orpheus is permitted to lead Eurydice back to the upper world under one condition. He must not look behind him until they reach the surface. The condition itself reflects ancient Greek ideas about trust, patience, and the irreversible nature of mortality. When Orpheus ultimately turns back too soon, Eurydice vanishes forever. What matters here is not only the tragedy, but the theological implication. Even Persephone, who sympathizes with human suffering, cannot simply overturn the laws of the underworld. Mercy exists, but cosmic order remains absolute. Another major myth that reveals Persephone's growing authority is the story of Theseus and Pirithous. According to the tradition, the two heroes foolishly decide to descend into the underworld and abduct Persephone herself so that Pirithous could marry her. The plan was considered one of the greatest acts of arrogance in Greek mythology because it directly challenged the sanctity of divine marriage and the authority of the underworld rulers. When the heroes arrive, they are trapped in magical seats that bind them in paralysis and forgetfulness. Ancient writers describe these chairs as supernatural instruments connected to the very laws of death itself. Years later, when Heracles descends into the underworld to capture Cerberus, he encounters the imprisoned heroes and asks permission to free them. Persephone's response again demonstrates her judicial complexity. She permits the release of Theseus, recognizing that he had acted more from loyalty to his companion than from personal ambition. But Pirithous, whose desire targeted Persephone directly, remains condemned forever. Ancient audiences saw this distinction as evidence of divine discernment rather than arbitrary punishment. Over time, the underworld itself became increasingly structured in Greek imagination. Ancient poets and philosophers developed elaborate descriptions of its geography. At its boundaries flowed the river Styx, whose waters even the gods feared. Oaths sworn upon the Styx were absolutely binding. A god who broke such an oath faced temporary exile from divine society itself. The ferryman Charon transported souls across these rivers, but only if they possessed the proper burial rites and payment. Archaeological discoveries throughout Greece have uncovered coins placed inside graves, often in the mouths or hands of the dead, confirming the widespread belief that souls required passage into the afterlife. Beyond the rivers stretched the various regions of the underworld. Tartarus lay in the deepest abyss, where cosmic criminals and enemies of the gods suffered eternal punishments. The Elysian fields represented paradise for heroes and exceptional individuals. Most souls, however, wandered the shadowed plains of ordinary Hades, existing as shades retaining memory, but lacking the fullness of mortal life. Persephone's role connected all these regions. As queen, she became associated not only with seasonal return, but with the management of transition itself. Her dual existence above and below made her uniquely qualified to mediate between life and death, memory and forgetting, emergence and disappearance. This duality became even more significant during the rise of mystery religions in the Hellenistic world. Initiates into various cult traditions increasingly viewed Persephone as a guide for the soul after death. In these beliefs, her annual return from the underworld symbolized the possibility that death itself was not final annihilation, but transformation. The Eleusinian mysteries especially emphasized this idea. Though the exact rituals remain secret even today, ancient testimonies consistently describe initiates emerging from the ceremonies with reduced fear of death. The myth of Persephone's return appears to have served as evidence that descent into darkness could eventually lead to renewal. This interpretation profoundly influenced Greek philosophical thought. By the time of later Platonism, Persephone was often interpreted symbolically as the soul descending into material existence. Her periodic return represented spiritual awakening and liberation from ignorance. Yet despite all these reinterpretations, the emotional core of the myth remained remarkably stable across centuries. The grief of Demeter, the separation of mother and daughter, the terror of descent, and the compromise between worlds continued forming the foundation of every version. And as Greek civilization spread across the Mediterranean through conquest, colonization, and trade, Persephone's myth traveled with it, merging with local traditions and influencing religious systems far beyond Greece itself. In Egypt, Asia Minor, Sicily, southern Italy, and eventually Rome, her story adapted to new cultures while preserving its central structure. What made Persephone endure across so many centuries was not merely the drama of her abduction, but the extraordinary flexibility of her symbolism. She could represent agriculture, kingship, death, rebirth, marriage, spiritual initiation, cosmic balance, or the soul itself. Very few ancient deities carried such a wide range of meanings while remaining recognizable across every reinterpretation. And as later ancient civilizations entered periods of instability, war, and religious transformation, Persephone's role would grow even larger, eventually becoming one of the central bridges between the old pagan world and the emerging spiritual philosophies that reshaped the Mediterranean forever. As centuries passed and the Greek world expanded through colonization, trade, warfare, and cultural exchange, the story of Persephone traveled far beyond the lands where it first emerged. What had once been a sacred agricultural myth rooted in local fertility rituals gradually transformed into one of the most influential religious narratives in the ancient Mediterranean. By the Hellenistic age, Persephone was no longer understood only as the daughter of Demeter or the seasonal queen of the underworld. She had become something much larger, a divine figure connected to the deepest fears and hopes of human existence. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It developed slowly as Greek culture encountered Egypt, Anatolia, Phoenicia, southern Italy, and eventually Rome. In every region, local traditions merged with the established mythology of Persephone, adding new layers of meaning while preserving the core structure of descent and return. In southern Italy and Sicily especially, Persephone's worship became extraordinarily important. Greek colonies established throughout Magna Graecia carried the cults of Demeter and Persephone into these regions, where they blended with older indigenous traditions connected to fertility, caves, springs, and chthonic deities associated with the earth itself. The landscape of Sicily became permanently tied to Persephone's mythology. Ancient writers repeatedly described the island as a threshold between worlds, a place where volcanic activity, deep caverns, and fertile plains created an environment that seemed both life-giving and terrifyingly unstable. To ancient observers, these natural features appeared to confirm the mythological claim that the earth itself had once opened there to allow Hades to emerge. One location became especially sacred, the area surrounding Lake Pergusa. Ancient sources described the lake as unnaturally calm and surrounded by endless flowering meadows. Even Roman travelers centuries later recorded local traditions claiming that this was the exact place where Persephone vanished beneath the earth. Archaeological excavations in the region have uncovered temples, ritual objects, and inscriptions dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, confirming that the site functioned as an active religious center for many generations. What made these Sicilian traditions especially powerful was the connection between Persephone and grain production. Sicily became one of the major agricultural centers of the ancient Mediterranean, supplying enormous quantities of wheat to Greek cities and later to Rome itself. Because of this, the fertility myths surrounding Persephone and Demeter gained direct political and economic importance. Good harvests were seen not simply as natural events, but as signs of divine favor and cosmic stability. This belief shaped entire state rituals. Festivals dedicated to Demeter and Persephone were often organized by civic authorities rather than private worshippers alone. Public processions carried sacred grain, torches, and floral offerings through city streets, while priests and priestesses reenacted elements of the myth. These ceremonies reinforced the idea that the prosperity of society itself depended on maintaining harmony with the divine cycle represented by Persephone's yearly movement between worlds. At the same time, Persephone's identity continued expanding beyond agriculture into the realm of death and the afterlife. During the classical and Hellenistic periods, many Greeks became increasingly concerned with what happened to the soul after death. Traditional Homeric ideas about the underworld had portrayed the dead as weak shadows existing in a bleak and joyless state. But mystery religions, especially the Eleusinian mysteries, offered a different possibility. Ancient testimonies about the mysteries are frustratingly vague because initiates were forbidden from revealing the details. However, surviving references from philosophers, playwrights, and historians strongly suggest that participants believed the rites offered spiritual transformation and hope for a better existence after death. The ceremonies at Eleusis unfolded over several stages. Initiates traveled in sacred processions from Athens to Eleusis, carrying torches that symbolized Demeter's search for Persephone. Ritual fasting imitated the grief of the goddess, while sacred reenactments likely dramatized the descent and return of Persephone herself. Ancient writers consistently describe the final experience of initiation as emotionally overwhelming, involving light emerging from darkness and revelations connected to the continuity of life beyond death. What mattered most was not intellectual explanation, but emotional transformation. Participants emerged believing they had gained insight into the hidden structure of existence. Cicero, writing during the Roman period, later claimed that the mysteries taught people not only how to live, but how to die with hope rather than fear. This shift is critical in understanding Persephone's growing significance. She was no longer merely a goddess associated with seasonal crops. She became a divine guarantee that descent into darkness did not necessarily mean permanent destruction. Her yearly return from the underworld symbolized the possibility that death itself might be part of a larger cycle rather than an irreversible ending. As these ideas spread, Persephone's symbolism became deeply connected to concepts of initiation and rebirth. Mystery cults throughout the Mediterranean increasingly adopted imagery associated with descent underground, ritual darkness, sacred journeys, and spiritual return. Many of these traditions incorporated elements directly inspired by Persephone's mythology. At the philosophical level, thinkers began interpreting the myth in increasingly abstract ways. Plato and later Neoplatonic philosophers viewed the soul as something temporarily trapped within the material world. In this framework, Persephone's descent represented the soul entering physical existence, while her return symbolized spiritual awakening and reunion with higher divine reality. This philosophical interpretation transformed the underworld from a literal place into a metaphysical condition. Hades became not only the realm of the dead, but the hidden dimension of existence itself, the unseen reality beneath ordinary human perception. Persephone, existing between worlds, became the mediator capable of crossing these boundaries. At the same time, her relationship with Hades also evolved in ancient interpretation. Early versions emphasized the violence of the abduction, but later traditions sometimes portray Persephone as gradually adapting to her role and even exercising significant authority beside the ruler of the dead. In artistic depictions from later centuries, the two are often shown seated together in formal symmetry, suggesting partnership rather than simple domination. This evolution reflects changing ancient ideas about queenship and divine marriage. In many Hellenistic kingdoms, royal women held increasing political and ceremonial importance. Persephone's status as queen of the underworld mirrored these developments, presenting her not merely as captive bride, but as co-ruler governing one half of the cosmos. Ancient magical texts also reveal another dimension of Persephone's growing influence. Cursed tablets, funerary inscriptions, and ritual invocations increasingly called upon Persephone alongside Hades in matters connected to spirits, dreams, vengeance, and communication with the dead. Her ability to move between life and death made her especially important in rituals involving transition and hidden knowledge. In some traditions, she even acquires darker associations linked to vengeance and inevitability. Certain Orphic texts describe Persephone as mother of underworld beings connected to punishment and cosmic justice. These traditions emphasize not her youthful innocence, but her terrifying authority over mortality itself. Yet despite these darker developments, Persephone never completely loses her earlier identity as Kore, the maiden associated with spring and renewal. This coexistence of opposites became one of the defining features of her mythology. She remained simultaneously a goddess of flowers and graves, birth and death, innocence and sovereignty. This complexity explains why Persephone became one of the most psychologically compelling figures in ancient religion. Unlike many deities associated with only one domain, she embodied contradiction itself. Ancient worshippers could see in her both the fear of losing life and the hope that something continued beyond it. As the Roman Empire expanded, these ideas spread even further. Roman authors identified Persephone with Proserpina and integrated her mythology into imperial religious culture. Temples dedicated to Ceres and Proserpina appeared throughout Roman territories, while mystery religions inspired by Greek traditions spread across North Africa, Gaul, Britain, and the Near East. Even as traditional pagan religion began weakening in late antiquity, Persephone's symbolism endured. Philosophers, mystics, and religious thinkers continued using her myth as a way to explain transformation, suffering, and spiritual rebirth. Her descent into darkness and return to light remained one of the most powerful symbolic structures inherited from the ancient world. And during the final centuries of the Roman Empire, as old religious systems faced collapse and entirely new faiths began reshaping the Mediterranean, Persephone's story would enter another extraordinary phase, influencing the transition from classical paganism into the spiritual imagination of late antiquity itself. By the final centuries of the Roman Empire, the world that had originally created the myth of Persephone was changing faster than at any point in its history. Ancient city-states had disappeared into empires. Traditional temples stood beside new religious movements arriving from the east. Philosophers debated the nature of the soul, while civil wars, invasions, famine, and political instability shook the Mediterranean world. Yet, during this era of collapse and transformation, the figure of Persephone did not disappear. Instead, her symbolism became even more powerful. One reason for this endurance was that Persephone's myth addressed fears that became especially intense during late antiquity. Fear of death, uncertainty about the afterlife, and anxiety about whether existence contained any deeper meaning beyond suffering and decay. As the Roman world entered periods of crisis, many people turned away from traditional civic religion and toward mystery cults, philosophical schools, and personal spiritual systems that promise salvation or hidden knowledge. In this environment, Persephone's story became more than mythology. It became a spiritual model. The old agricultural interpretation still existed, especially in rural areas where seasonal cycles remained central to survival. Farmers continued offering grain and flowers to Demeter and Persephone in hopes of favorable harvests. But in urban centers like Alexandria, Athens, Antioch, and Rome, intellectuals increasingly interpreted the myth through philosophy and mysticism rather than literal theology. Neoplatonic philosophers, especially those influenced by Plato's teachings on the immortality of the soul, saw Persephone as representing consciousness descending into the material world. According to these thinkers, the soul originally belonged to a higher divine reality, but became trapped in physical existence, much like Persephone became bound to the underworld through the consumption of the pomegranate seeds. This interpretation radically transformed the meaning of the myth. The underworld was no longer only a place beneath the earth. It became symbolic of material existence itself, a realm of limitation, suffering, forgetfulness, and mortality. Persephone's periodic return to the surface symbolized moments of spiritual awakening, when the soul temporarily remembered its divine origin. These philosophical ideas spread widely among educated elites of the late Roman world. Writers and teachers increasingly used Persephone's journey as a metaphor for spiritual initiation. The soul descends into darkness, loses its original innocence, gains painful knowledge, and then struggles toward illumination and reunion with higher truth. At the same time, the old mystery traditions continued operating in secretive forms. The Eleusinian mysteries remained active for centuries under Roman rule and attracted initiates from across the empire. Emperors, generals, philosophers, and poets all traveled to Eleusis seeking participation in the sacred rites. Ancient testimonies suggest that initiation into the mysteries was considered life-changing. Participants often spoke afterward about losing their fear of death. Some described witnessing sacred visions or experiencing overwhelming emotional revelations connected to rebirth and eternity. What made Persephone central to these experiences was her unique position among ancient deities. Unlike gods who remained distant from suffering, Persephone experienced transformation herself. She descended into darkness. She lost her previous life. She became divided between worlds. Because of this, worshippers believed she understood both mortality and transcendence in ways other gods could not. This gave her mythology extraordinary emotional depth during periods of instability. As plague, war, and economic collapse spread across parts of the empire, Persephone's cycle of descent and return offered reassurance that destruction might not be final. Her story suggested that endings could contain hidden beginnings. Meanwhile, the underworld itself continued evolving in late antique imagination. Earlier Greek traditions had described Hades as a shadowy, but morally neutral realm. But over time, especially under philosophical and mystery cult influence, the afterlife became increasingly moralized. Souls were now thought to undergo purification, judgment, or spiritual progression after death. Persephone's role expanded alongside these developments. In some late texts, she appears almost as a cosmic judge overseeing transitions between different states of existence. Certain Orphic traditions even portray her as the mother of underworld spirits connected to justice and punishment. These darker interpretations emphasized her sovereignty and authority rather than her youthful identity as Kore. At the same time, magical traditions throughout the Mediterranean began invoking Persephone in rituals connected to dreams, necromancy, protection, and communication with spirits. Hundreds of cursed tablets discovered by archaeologists invoke Persephone alongside Hades and other underworld powers. These tablets were often buried in graves, wells, or underground chambers because practitioners believed Persephone's realm existed beneath the visible world. The language used in these rituals is revealing. Persephone is frequently described not only as Queen of the Dead, but as she who knows the hidden paths, or Mistress of the Unseen Gates. Such titles show how deeply her image had become associated with mysteries inaccessible to ordinary human understanding. This connection to hidden knowledge also explains why Persephone became linked to initiation rituals beyond Eleusis. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, many cults adopted symbolic journeys into darkness followed by revelation or rebirth. Caves, underground chambers, and nighttime ceremonies became common settings for these rites because they mirrored Persephone's own descent beneath the earth. The geography of the underworld itself also grew increasingly elaborate in late antiquity. Ancient writers described rivers separating memory from forgetfulness, judges assigning souls to different fates, and pathways leading either toward punishment or purification. Philosophers attempted to systematize these ideas into complex cosmologies, combining mythology with metaphysical theory. Within these systems, Persephone often occupied a central mediating role. She belonged neither entirely to Olympus nor entirely to Hades. She moved between dimensions, carrying authority from both realms. This made her a perfect symbol for transition itself, not just between life and death, but between ignorance and knowledge, suffering and renewal, mortality and transcendence. However, while these philosophical and mystical interpretations flourished, another enormous transformation was beginning to reshape the Mediterranean world entirely: the rise of Christianity. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, older pagan traditions gradually lost political power. Temples closed, public sacrifices declined, and many ancient religious institutions disappeared. Yet interestingly, Persephone's myth did not vanish immediately. Instead, elements of her symbolism survived in altered forms. Some early Christian writers condemned the old myths as pagan falsehoods, but others recognized that Persephone's story contained themes deeply meaningful to ancient audiences: death and return, suffering and renewal, descent and resurrection. Though Christianity rejected the literal worship of Persephone, the emotional structure of her mythology remained familiar to populations transitioning into new religious systems. In some regions, festivals once associated with Demeter and Persephone slowly transformed into seasonal Christian celebrations tied to spring, harvest, or remembrance of the dead. Sacred sites previously connected to chthonic deities were sometimes repurposed into churches or monasteries, preserving the geographic continuity of worship even as theology changed. The destruction of the sanctuary at Eleusis during the late 4th century AD symbolized the end of one era. The mysteries that had survived for nearly 2,000 years finally disappeared under pressure from imperial Christianization and political unrest. Yet even after the sanctuary's decline, the myth itself endured in literature, philosophy, and memory. Writers in Byzantium continued referencing Persephone as a symbol of seasonal return and spiritual transformation. Medieval scholars preserved ancient manuscripts containing her story. Renaissance humanists later rediscovered these texts and reintroduced Persephone into European art, poetry, and philosophy. But even within antiquity itself, before the final collapse of the old pagan world, Persephone had already become something far greater than a local fertility goddess from early Greek religion. Across centuries of reinterpretation, she evolved into one of the ancient world's deepest symbols of transformation. She represented the terrifying reality that innocence cannot remain untouched forever. She embodied the truth that growth often requires descent into darkness. And she reflected the belief, shared across countless generations, that life and death are not separate kingdoms, but connected phases within the same eternal cycle. As the ancient Mediterranean entered its final transition from classical civilization into the medieval world, Persephone's myth remained suspended between memory and transformation, just like the goddess herself, never entirely belonging to one realm alone. Even after the political collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the gradual disappearance of most public pagan worship across the Mediterranean, the memory of Persephone did not vanish with the temples dedicated to her. Many ancient gods faded into obscurity once sacrifices stopped and priesthoods disappeared. But Persephone survived in a different way. Her story had become too deeply connected to universal human fears and hopes to simply be forgotten. The civilizations that came after the ancient Greeks and Romans inherited fragments of her myth, even when they no longer worshipped her directly. The closing of pagan sanctuaries during late antiquity marked a dramatic transformation in Mediterranean religious life. Temples that had stood for centuries were abandoned, converted, or destroyed. Sacred processions ended. Public rituals disappeared. And the old mystery religions, including the Eleusinian mysteries, were gradually suppressed under imperial decrees favoring Christianity. But while official religious structures collapsed, cultural memory endured. Ancient manuscripts containing the myths of Persephone continued to survive in libraries, monasteries, and scholarly collections scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. Byzantine scholars copied and preserved many classical texts, not because they still believed in the old gods, but because Greek literature remained central to education and intellectual culture. As a result, works like the Homeric hymn to Demeter, as well as writings by Ovid, Pausanias, and later Neoplatonic philosophers, escaped destruction and passed into future centuries. During the Byzantine period, Persephone's mythology no longer functioned as living religion, yet her symbolic presence remained powerful within literature and philosophy. Scholars often treated the ancient myths as allegorical narratives containing moral or metaphysical truths rather than literal accounts of divine beings. Persephone's descent into the underworld was increasingly interpreted as representing the soul's confrontation with suffering, temptation, ignorance, or mortality itself. This allegorical approach allowed ancient myths to survive in cultures that no longer accepted pagan theology. Persephone became less a goddess to be worshipped and more a symbol to be interpreted. At the same time, traces of her older religious identity lingered among rural populations long after official paganism disappeared. In isolated regions of Greece, southern Italy, and parts of Anatolia, local seasonal customs preserved echoes of earlier fertility traditions. Festivals connected to spring flowers, harvest cycles, mourning rituals, and symbolic returns from darkness often retained structural similarities to older Demeter and Persephone ceremonies, even after they had been absorbed into Christian calendars. This continuity happened because agricultural societies continued, depending on seasonal cycles regardless of religious transformation. Planting, harvest, winter scarcity, and spring renewal remained realities shaping everyday life. The emotional power of Persephone's myth, loss followed by return, still resonated with communities whose survival depended on the rhythm of the earth. Meanwhile, throughout the medieval period, ancient underworld imagery also survived in transformed forms. Christian concepts of hell, purgatory, paradise, and judgment developed independently in many ways, yet the cultural memory of classical underworld geography influenced medieval imagination. Rivers separating worlds, judges of the dead, shadowed plains, and journeys through darkness all retained echoes of earlier Greek ideas connected to Hades and Persephone's domain. One reason Persephone's symbolism remains so adaptable is because her myth was never entirely about punishment or salvation. It was about transition. Unlike many religious systems that sharply divide existence into good and evil, heaven and hell, Persephone's story existed in the space between categories. She belonged to both life and death simultaneously. This ambiguity made her myth remarkably durable across changing civilizations. As Europe moved into the Renaissance centuries later, interest in the classical world exploded once again. Ancient Greek and Roman texts were rediscovered, translated, and studied by scholars, artists, and philosophers eager to reconnect with lost knowledge from antiquity. During this revival, Persephone emerged once more as one of the most fascinating figures of ancient mythology. Renaissance artists became captivated by the dramatic imagery of her abduction. Paintings and sculptures depicted the moment when the earth opened and Hades carried Persephone into darkness. These works often emphasized emotional intensity, beauty, and movement rather than theological meaning, reflecting Renaissance artistic priorities. Yet, even in these reinterpretations, the deeper themes remained intact. Persephone still represented transformation through loss. She still embodied the crossing of boundaries that cannot easily be reversed. Writers and philosophers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods also found new meanings in her story. Some interpreted the myth psychologically, seeing Persephone's descent as symbolic of maturity and the loss of innocence. Others focused on the agricultural cycle preserved in the narrative, recognizing it as evidence of ancient humanity's attempt to understand nature through sacred storytelling. By the 19th century, archaeologists and historians began uncovering physical evidence connected to Persephone's worship across the Mediterranean. Excavations at Eleusis revealed the remains of massive ritual halls where initiates once gathered for the mysteries. In Sicily, archaeologists uncovered sanctuaries associated with Demeter and Persephone near regions long identified in local tradition as sites connected to the abduction myth. These discoveries transformed scholarly understanding of the ancient world. Persephone was no longer viewed merely as a literary character, but as the center of one of the most important religious systems in Mediterranean history. Researchers realized that millions of people across many centuries had organized rituals, festivals, and spiritual beliefs around her story. At the same time, the growth of psychology and anthropology in the modern era introduced entirely new interpretations. Thinkers such as Carl Jung viewed Persephone as an archetypal figure representing transformation through descent into the unconscious mind. Her movement between worlds symbolized the human experience of confronting hidden fears, trauma, and internal change. Anthropologists studying comparative mythology noticed that stories resembling Persephone's journey appeared in many cultures around the world. Myths involving descent into darkness, disappearance, seasonal death, and rebirth seem to emerge repeatedly across civilizations separated by geography and language. This suggested that Persephone's myth reflected universal human concerns rather than merely local Greek tradition. Modern feminist interpretations introduced yet another layer. Some scholars argued that Persephone's story reflects ancient tensions surrounding marriage, female autonomy, and patriarchal control within Greek society. Others emphasized her transformation from powerless maiden into powerful queen, interpreting the myth as a narrative of adaptation and emergence rather than simple victimhood. These modern debates demonstrate something extraordinary about Persephone's mythology. It continues evolving thousands of years after its creation. Very few ancient figures have remained so continuously relevant across radically different historical periods. From Bronze Age fertility rituals to classical mystery religions, from Roman poetry to Byzantine philosophy, from Renaissance art to modern psychology, Persephone has repeatedly been reinterpreted without losing her essential identity. Part of this endurance comes from the structure of the myth itself. At its core lies an experience recognizable across all human history: the confrontation with irreversible change. Persephone begins as Kore, the untouched maiden gathering flowers in eternal spring. Then the ground opens. The familiar world disappears. Innocence is lost forever. But instead of being destroyed, she transforms. She becomes something more complex, more powerful, and more mysterious than she had been before. Ancient audiences understood this transformation through religion and seasonal cycles. Later cultures understood it through philosophy, literature, psychology, or symbolism. But the emotional truth remained the same. That is why Persephone survived the collapse of empires and religions. Her myth speaks to experiences no civilization escapes: grief, separation, transition, mortality, and the hope that something meaningful can emerge from darkness. And as modern archaeology, historical research, and renewed interest in ancient mythology continue uncovering new layers of the classical world, Persephone remains one of the clearest windows into how ancient humanity understood not only death, but the fragile and mysterious balance connecting destruction and renewal across all existence. Long before modern historians began analyzing ancient myths as literature or psychology, the people who worship Persephone experienced her story as something immediate and real, woven directly into the structure of the world around them. To understand why her mythology became so powerful across centuries, it is necessary to understand the ancient mindset itself, a worldview in which nature, politics, agriculture, death, and divine order were not separate categories, but interconnected parts of a single living cosmos. In the ancient Mediterranean, survival depended entirely on forces humans could not control. A single failed harvest could destroy entire cities through famine. Drought, plague, storms, or war could erase years of prosperity almost overnight. Because of this, ancient people did not view nature as neutral. They saw it as animated by divine powers whose emotions and decisions directly shaped human life. Within this worldview, Persephone's disappearance was not symbolic fiction. It explained why the earth itself seemed to die each year. When winter arrived and fields became barren, ancient communities experienced this transformation as a real withdrawal of divine presence from the world. Crops vanished into the soil. Trees lost their leaves. Flowers disappeared. Life retreated underground. To societies dependent on agriculture, this process felt terrifyingly close to death itself. The myth of Persephone gave structure to that fear. According to the sacred cycle preserved in Greek religious tradition, Persephone's descent into the underworld caused Demeter to mourn so deeply that she withdrew fertility from the earth. Grain stopped growing. Fields became empty. Humanity approached starvation. Only Persephone's return restored balance and allowed spring to emerge again. This cycle transformed ordinary seasonal change into cosmic drama. Winter became the visible sign of separation between worlds. Spring became proof that return was possible. What made this myth especially powerful was its connection to actual agricultural reality. Ancient farmers placed seeds into the ground where they seemed to disappear into darkness before emerging again months later, transformed into living plants. To many ancient cultures, this resembled death followed by rebirth. The earth itself appeared to swallow life temporarily and then release it once more. Persephone became the divine embodiment of this mystery. Ancient rituals connected to her worship often reflected this agricultural symbolism directly. Sacred grain was buried underground during ceremonies before being uncovered again during festivals celebrating renewal. Torches symbolizing Demeter's search were carried through nighttime processions, representing movement through darkness toward restoration. The emotional impact of these rituals must have been immense. Entire communities participated together, experiencing fear, grief, hope, and relief as part of a sacred cycle that mirrored their dependence on nature itself. But Persephone's mythology also expanded beyond agriculture into politics and kingship. Many ancient rulers throughout the Mediterranean sought to connect themselves symbolically to divine cycles of death and renewal. Kings were expected not only to govern, but to maintain harmony between humanity and the gods. If crops failed or disaster struck, rulers could be blamed for losing divine favor. Because of this, rulers often participated in rituals associated with fertility deities like Demeter and Persephone. In some regions, political authority itself became linked to sacred agricultural ceremonies. The prosperity of the kingdom depended on maintaining cosmic balance, and Persephone's cycle represented one of the clearest expressions of that balance. This connection between kingship and underworld symbolism became especially strong during the Hellenistic period after the conquest of Alexander the Great. As Greek culture spread across Egypt, Persia, and Asia Minor, local traditions merged with Greek mythology, creating increasingly elaborate systems connecting rulers to divine cycles. Some Hellenistic rulers even associated themselves with underworld imagery to emphasize their role as mediators between mortal and divine realms. Persephone's ability to move between worlds made her an ideal symbol for royal authority that claimed both earthly and cosmic legitimacy. Meanwhile, philosophers continued expanding the myth's meaning into the structure of existence itself. The ancient Greeks were deeply fascinated by cycles. They observed patterns everywhere: day and night, summer and winter, birth and death, planting and harvest, growth and decay. Over time, many thinkers concluded that reality itself operated through recurring transformation rather than permanent stability. Persephone's story became one of the clearest mythological expressions of this idea. Unlike myths centered on final victory or permanent endings, Persephone's narrative never truly concludes. She does not escape the underworld forever, nor does she remain trapped there permanently. Instead, she moves endlessly between states of being. Her existence becomes cyclical rather than linear. This distinction profoundly shaped ancient thought. To many philosophers and mystery cult initiates, Persephone represented the truth that existence itself operates through alternation. Life requires death. Growth requires decay. Emergence requires descent. Nothing remains fixed forever. This perspective differed sharply from later religious systems emphasizing absolute separation between salvation and damnation. In Persephone's mythology, darkness is not merely evil. It is necessary. The underworld is terrifying, but is also part of the cosmic order sustaining renewal. This complexity explains why Persephone remained psychologically compelling across so many historical eras. Ancient audiences could see in her both vulnerability and authority. She begins as Kore, the innocent maiden gathering flowers under open skies. But after descending into darkness, she becomes queen of the dead, transformed by knowledge no surface deity fully possesses. Importantly, ancient texts rarely portray this transformation as simple corruption. Persephone does not become monstrous. Instead, she becomes wiser, more powerful, and more distant from ordinary innocence. This idea resonated deeply within Greek tragedy and philosophy, where suffering often produces knowledge impossible to gain otherwise. The Greeks even had a concept for this: pathei mathos, learning through suffering. Persephone embodies this principle perfectly. Her descent strips away innocence, but grants authority and understanding inaccessible to untouched youth. Many later writers recognized this psychological depth. In Roman retellings, Persephone's role as queen increasingly overshadows her earlier identity as passive victim. Artists depict her enthroned beside Hades with regal composure rather than fear. The transformation suggests adaptation rather than annihilation. At the same time, fear always remained central to her mythology. The underworld represented humanity's greatest uncertainty. Ancient people feared not only death itself, but the unknown waiting beyond it. Would consciousness continue? Would the dead remember their former lives? Could souls suffer eternally? These questions haunted ancient religion and philosophy alike. Persephone occupied a unique position within this fear because she alone crossed the boundary repeatedly. She knew both the world of the living and the world of the dead intimately. This made her simultaneously comforting and terrifying. To initiates of mystery religions, she represented hope that death was not final extinction. But to others, she symbolized the unavoidable reality that every living thing eventually descends into darkness. Ancient funerary art reflects this duality vividly. Tomb inscriptions and grave paintings often depict Persephone with torches guiding souls through shadowed pathways. Some images emphasize serenity and reunion, while others stress solemn inevitability. Archaeologists have uncovered countless grave offerings connected to Persephone worship throughout Greece, southern Italy, and Asia Minor. Many contain flowers, miniature pomegranates, or inscriptions asking for safe passage into the underworld. These objects reveal how personally ancient people related to her mythology. For them, Persephone was not distant mythology. She was directly connected to what happened after death. As centuries passed, her myth accumulated more layers without losing its original emotional core. Agricultural cycle, political symbolism, philosophical allegory, psychological transformation, and spiritual initiation all became part of her identity simultaneously. Very few mythological figures achieved this level of symbolic complexity. And perhaps that is why Persephone continued surviving even when entire civilizations disappeared around her. Empires rose and collapsed. Religions transformed. Languages evolved. Yet the image remained recognizable. A young woman gathering flowers beneath sunlight, the earth opening beneath her feet, and a journey into darkness that changes not only her own fate, but the balance of the entire world forever. To truly understand the power of Persephone in the ancient world, it is not enough to study the myths alone. The stories preserved in poems and literature were only one part of a much larger religious reality. For ordinary people across Greece and later the Roman Empire, Persephone was not merely a character from sacred narratives. She was part of rituals, processions, initiations, mourning ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and secret rites that shaped the emotional and spiritual life of entire communities. Among all ancient religious traditions connected to Persephone, none became more influential or mysterious than the sacred ceremonies held at Eleusis, a town located near Athens that developed into one of the most important religious centers of the Mediterranean world. The rituals performed there, known collectively as the Eleusinian Mysteries, endured for nearly 2,000 years and attracted initiates from every level of society, from farmers and laborers to philosophers, generals, and Roman emperors. What made the mysteries extraordinary was their secrecy. Unlike public religious festivals where rituals were visible to entire cities, the inner ceremonies of Eleusis were revealed only to initiates. Ancient participants swore sacred oaths never to disclose exactly what they experienced within the sanctuary. Breaking that oath was considered one of the gravest possible offenses, punishable both legally and spiritually. Because of this secrecy, historians still do not know every detail of what occurred during the mysteries. Yet ancient testimonies provide enough fragments to reconstruct the broad structure and emotional significance of the ceremonies. The mysteries unfolded annually over several days and involved long processions from Athens to Eleusis along what became known as the Sacred Way. Thousands of participants traveled together carrying torches, singing hymns, chanting sacred phrases, and reenacting aspects of Demeter's search for Persephone. This journey itself was symbolic. Participants physically moved from ordinary civic life toward a sacred landscape associated with death, loss, revelation, and transformation. The torchlight processions represented Demeter wandering through darkness, searching for her daughter. Ancient writers describe the atmosphere as emotionally intense, filled with anticipation, exhaustion, and ritual purification. Before entering the inner sanctuary, initiates underwent fasting and cleansing rituals. These acts mirrored Demeter's grief after Persephone's disappearance. By denying themselves food and comfort, participants symbolically shared in the suffering of the goddess herself. Then came the most secretive phase of all. Ancient sources refer vaguely to sacred objects displayed in darkness, dramatic revelations of light, spoken formulas, ritual reenactments, and emotional experiences so profound that participants described them as life-changing. Many initiates later claimed they no longer feared death afterward. This point is extremely important. The Eleusinian mysteries did not simply teach mythology. They transformed Persephone's descent into a personal spiritual experience. Initiates did not merely hear about darkness and return. They symbolically passed through those stages themselves. Several ancient authors attempted to describe the impact without revealing forbidden details. The Roman statesman Cicero later wrote that the mysteries taught humanity how to live joyfully and die with hope. Other writers spoke of moving from fear into illumination, from confusion into understanding. The implication is clear. Persephone's return from the underworld symbolized the possibility that death itself might not be the end of existence. This belief became one of the most emotionally powerful ideas in the ancient world. Traditional Greek religion had often portrayed the afterlife as bleak and uncertain. In Homeric literature, the dead exist as shadows lacking vitality and purpose. But the mystery religions associated with Persephone offered something radically different, the hope of transformation beyond death. Because of this promise, the mysteries spread immense influence across the Mediterranean. By the Roman period, initiation at Eleusis became almost a spiritual status symbol among elites. Emperors, including Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, participated in the rites, believing they connected initiates to ancient divine truths older than ordinary civic religion. Archaeological excavations at Eleusis reveal the enormous scale of this religious system. The sanctuary expanded continuously for centuries, eventually containing massive halls capable of holding thousands of initiates simultaneously. Sacred wells, underground chambers, ritual pathways, and storage areas for sacred objects demonstrate how elaborate the ceremonies became over time. The central initiation hall, known as the Telesterion, was one of the largest religious structures in the Greek world. Ancient architects designed it specifically to create controlled experiences of darkness, sound, movement, and revelation. Torches illuminated certain areas while other spaces remained hidden in shadow. Participants likely experienced carefully staged transitions intended to mirror Persephone's descent into and return from the underworld. This use of architecture to create emotional transformation was remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world. But Eleusis was not the only place where Persephone's worship flourished. Across Greece, southern Italy, Sicily, Asia Minor, and the Black Sea region, local festivals celebrated different aspects of her mythology. Some emphasized agricultural fertility, while others focused on mourning, rebirth, or communication with the dead. In Sicily, where many ancient traditions placed the site of Persephone's abduction, women played especially important roles in rituals connected to Demeter and Persephone. Ancient sources describe ceremonies involving fasting, lamentation, floral offerings, and symbolic reenactments of loss and reunion. Certain festivals lasted for days and included periods where participants isolated themselves from ordinary society. During these rituals, women mourned Persephone's descent much as Demeter mourned her daughter's disappearance. Then, when the ritual shifted toward Persephone's return, celebrations erupted with music, feasting, dancing, and offerings of grain and fruit. The emotional rhythm of these ceremonies mirrored the myth itself, grief followed by restoration. This structure allowed worshippers to experience sacred transformation collectively. Ritual became a way of processing not only agricultural uncertainty, but human suffering more generally. The connection between Persephone and women's lives became especially significant in ancient Greek society. Many scholars believe the myth reflected real social anxieties surrounding marriage and separation. In ancient Greece, young women often left their childhood homes permanently after marriage, entering unfamiliar households where they possessed limited autonomy. Persephone's abrupt transition from maidenhood to queenship in the underworld may have resonated deeply with these experiences. Ancient wedding rituals sometimes included imagery connected to Persephone, emphasizing marriage as a form of symbolic transition between worlds. Brides carried torches similar to those used in Demeter's search, and some ceremonies invoke Persephone directly as both maiden and queen. This dual symbolism made Persephone uniquely complex. She represented innocence and experience, youth and maturity, vulnerability and authority simultaneously. At the same time, darker rituals connected to Persephone also developed. Because of her role as queen of the underworld, Persephone became associated with necromancy, curses, and communication with spirits. Archaeologists have discovered curse tablets buried in graves or wells invoking Persephone's power over the dead. These tablets often requested vengeance, justice, or supernatural intervention against enemies. Some rituals called upon Persephone to guide restless spirits or reveal hidden knowledge through dreams. Underground caves and chasms were especially associated with her worship because ancient people believed entrances to the underworld existed beneath the earth. At sites like Heracleoponica in parts of southern Italy, priests conducted ceremonies in subterranean chambers where initiates descended physically underground before emerging again into daylight. These journeys symbolized death and rebirth directly, recreating Persephone's own movement between worlds. Such rituals reveal how ancient religion blended psychological experience with mythology. Darkness, isolation, torchlight, chanting, and descent into enclosed spaces created intense emotional states long before modern understanding of ritual psychology existed. The ancients may not have explained these experiences scientifically, but they clearly understood their power. As Persephone's worship spread, it absorbed local traditions from many regions. In Egypt, Greek settlers connected aspects of her mythology to older Egyptian beliefs about death and resurrection. In Asia Minor, she merged with local mother goddess traditions associated with caves, mountains, and fertility. This adaptability allowed Persephone's cult to survive enormous historical changes. Even when public belief in the Olympian gods began weakening during late antiquity, the emotional structure of Persephone's rituals remained compelling. Descent into darkness followed by return to light continued resonating with populations living through plague, war, economic collapse, and political uncertainty. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about Persephone's ancient worship. It was never only about explaining nature. It was about confronting the deepest terror every human society faces, the fear that loss is permanent, that death ends everything, that darkness cannot be escaped. Persephone's myth did not deny these fears. Instead, it passed directly through them, descending into darkness before offering even the smallest possibility of return. That promise, fragile but powerful, kept her story alive through centuries of changing civilizations, secret rituals, and sacred memory long after countless other ancient gods had faded into silence. For the ancient Greeks, the underworld ruled by Hades and Persephone was not imagined as a vague, abstract realm. It was understood as a real place with geography, laws, rivers, gates, punishments, judges, and boundaries separating the living from the dead. Ancient poets, priests, Philosophers and mystery cults spent centuries describing this hidden kingdom beneath the earth, constructing one of the most detailed visions of the afterlife in all ancient religion. To understand Persephone fully, it is necessary to descend into this world itself, because once she became queen of the underworld, her identity transformed completely. She was no longer only the maiden Kore gathering flowers in spring meadows. She became ruler over the greatest mystery confronting humanity, death itself. The ancient Greeks imagined the entrance to the underworld in many different locations across the Mediterranean. Deep caves, volcanic fissures, underground springs, swamps, and shadowed lakes were all believed to function as possible gateways into the realm below. Certain places inspired particular fear because they appeared unnatural, emitting poisonous gases, strange sounds, or sudden disappearances of animals. One of the most famous entrances was located at Cape Taenarum in southern Greece, where ancient travelers described a cavern descending into darkness near the sea. Another was associated with Lake Avernus in Italy, whose volcanic fumes were said to kill birds flying overhead. Such locations reinforced the belief that the boundary between life and death existed physically beneath the earth. Ancient funerary traditions reflected this geography directly. The dead were buried with coins placed in their mouths or hands to pay the ferryman Charon for passage across the infernal rivers. Without proper burial rites and payment, souls were believed to wander restlessly near the entrance to the underworld for eternity. This fear of becoming trapped between worlds haunted Greek religious consciousness. After death, according to most traditions, souls first approached the banks of the river Styx or sometimes the river Acheron. These rivers formed the boundary separating the living from the dead. Ancient writers described the waters as black, cold, and unnaturally still, carrying an atmosphere of irreversible separation. Charon waited there in silence. Descriptions of Charon portray him as grim, ancient, and emotionally detached, not evil, but utterly indifferent. His task was eternal transportation of souls into the underworld. Ancient art often depicts him standing within a narrow boat gripping a long pole while newly dead spirits approach hesitantly from the shore. The crossing itself held profound symbolic meaning. Once a soul entered Charon's boat and crossed the river, return became nearly impossible. The living world faded behind them forever. Beyond the rivers stood the gates of the underworld, guarded by the monstrous Cerberus. Ancient sources describe Cerberus as a gigantic hound with 3 heads, serpent tails, and burning eyes. His role was not primarily to keep souls out, but to prevent the dead from escaping back into the world of the living. This detail is important because Greek mythology consistently portrays death as a one-way movement. Heroes who attempted to reverse it almost always failed. Once inside the underworld, souls entered a vast and complex landscape. Contrary to modern assumptions, the Greek underworld was not simply a place of punishment. Most souls existed in a shadowy neutral condition. Ancient poets described endless gray plains filled with drifting spirits lacking the strength and vitality they possessed during life. These souls retained memory and identity, but existed as diminished versions of themselves. Homer's descriptions in the Odyssey emphasize this bleakness strongly. When Odysseus encounters the spirit of Achilles in the underworld, the dead hero declares he would rather serve as a poor laborer among the living than rule over all the dead. This reveals how deeply ancient Greeks feared death. The underworld represented loss of sunlight, sensation, physical life, and human connection. Even great heroes became shadows there. Yet over time, Greek religious thought evolved. Later traditions introduced moral divisions within the underworld, creating separate regions for punishment, purification, and reward. The most feared region was Tartarus. Ancient writers described Tartarus as lying far beneath even Hades itself, separated by enormous distances and bronze barriers. It functioned as a prison for enemies of divine order and for mortals guilty of extraordinary crimes. Here existed figures like Sisyphus endlessly pushing his boulder uphill only for it to roll back down again. Nearby suffered Tantalus, forever tormented by unreachable food and water. Ixion spun eternally upon his burning wheel. These punishments fascinated Greek imagination because they symbolized crimes transformed into eternal psychological suffering. Punishment in Tartarus was rarely random torture. Instead, it reflected the offender's actions or character. At the opposite extreme lay the Elysian fields. Unlike the shadowed plains of ordinary souls, Elysium represented eternal beauty and peace reserved for heroes, initiates, and the exceptionally virtuous. Ancient descriptions portray meadows filled with flowers, gentle winds, music, athletic contests, and endless spring. Importantly, some mystery traditions connected Persephone directly to access into Elysium. Initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries believe participation in sacred rites improved one's fate after death. Persephone, as queen of the underworld, possessed authority over these transitions. She became not merely ruler of death, but gatekeeper determining whether souls remained trapped in shadow or moved toward blessed existence. This transformed her role dramatically. Earlier Greek religion often portrayed underworld powers as distant and terrifying, but mystery traditions increasingly presented Persephone as compassionate toward initiates and those properly prepared for death. Gold tablets discovered in ancient graves provide astonishing evidence for these beliefs. Buried with the dead, these tablets contain instructions for navigating the underworld. Many directly reference Persephone. One famous inscription tells the soul to declare, "I am child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is heavenly." Other tablets instruct souls to seek specific springs, avoid the waters of forgetfulness, and present themselves before Persephone with sacred knowledge gained during initiation. These texts reveal how deeply some ancient Greeks believed the afterlife involved not passive existence, but an active spiritual journey requiring preparation and understanding. Persephone stood at the center of that journey. As queen of the underworld, she occupied a uniquely paradoxical role. She was associated simultaneously with death and renewal, darkness and rebirth. This duality shaped nearly every aspect of her kingdom. Ancient art often reflects this complexity through symbolic imagery. Persephone is frequently shown holding torches, symbols of guidance through darkness. In other depictions, she carries grain or flowers, reminders that life still exists even within the realm of death. The pomegranate remained especially important. Its blood-red seeds symbolized both mortality and fertility. By consuming them, Persephone became permanently connected to the underworld. Ancient viewers would have understood this not merely as magical law, but as symbolic truth. Once someone experiences death or profound transformation, innocence cannot fully return. This idea made Persephone psychologically different from many other Olympian deities. Gods like Apollo or Athena remain largely unchanged throughout mythology. Persephone evolves. Her authority emerges through descent into darkness. Because of this, later philosophical traditions increasingly treated her myth as representing spiritual transformation itself. The underworld became symbolic not only of death, but of hidden truth, unconscious fear, suffering, and the parts of existence humans struggle to confront directly. Even ancient necromantic traditions reflected this understanding. Certain rituals attempted to summon spirits through invocations to Persephone and Hades. Practitioners believed the underworld queen possessed unique knowledge unavailable to surface gods. Her realm contained memory, destiny, and truths hidden from ordinary life. This connection between Persephone and hidden knowledge explains why caves and underground sanctuaries became central to many of her rituals. Descending physically beneath the earth mirrored spiritual descent into mystery. The ancient world was filled with fear of what waited after death. But Persephone's mythology offered something unusual within that fear. not certainty, but movement. Souls traveled. Seasons returned. Seeds emerged again after burial underground. Even the queen of the dead herself moved continually between darkness and light. That cyclical vision separated Persephone's underworld from later concepts of final eternal judgment. In her mythology, death was terrifying, but it was also connected to transformation. And for countless ancient worshippers standing before graves, descending into initiation chambers, or carrying torches through sacred night processions, the possibility of transformation may have been the only hope powerful enough to confront the silence waiting beneath the earth. To modern audiences, Persephone is often remembered primarily as a tragic figure, the innocent maiden abducted into darkness. But this understanding captures only one side of her ancient identity. As centuries passed, Persephone evolved into something far more terrifying and powerful than the flower-gathering daughter described in early hymns. In many parts of the Greek world, people feared her not merely as a victim of the underworld, but as one of its rulers. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It developed gradually as Greek religious thought became more focused on death, the soul, curses, hidden powers beneath the earth, and the dangerous forces governing fate itself. The deeper Persephone became connected to the underworld, the less she resembled the carefree Kore of spring meadows, and the more she embodied the frightening mysteries hidden beneath all mortal existence. Ancient Greek religion contained an important concept modern audiences sometimes overlook. Gods associated with the underworld inspired fear precisely because they operated beyond normal human control. Unlike deities connected to sunlight, war, or the sea, chthonic gods, the gods beneath the earth, governed invisible forces. They ruled death, decay, burial, spirits, dreams, curses, and the hidden movement of destiny. Persephone eventually became one of the most important among them. In many ancient texts, people avoided speaking her name casually. Instead, they used titles and euphemisms out of caution or reverence. She was called the Dread Queen, the Pure One, she who receives many, or simply the Mistress. These titles reveal something important about ancient psychology. People feared attracting the attention of underworld powers unnecessarily. This fear extended into ritual behavior. Sacrifices to Olympian gods like Zeus or Apollo usually occurred during daylight with celebrations, music, and open altars. Chthonic rituals connected to Persephone were different. They often took place at night, underground, or near graves, caves, and pits dug into the earth. Animals sacrificed to underworld deities were frequently black rather than white. Their blood was poured downward into the soil instead of upward toward the sky. Worshippers lowered their heads rather than raising them toward heaven. Everything about these ceremonies reflected descent. Archaeologists excavating ancient sanctuaries dedicated to Persephone have uncovered evidence supporting these darker aspects of her worship. In southern Italy, Sicily, and parts of mainland Greece, ritual sites associated with her cult often contained underground chambers, hidden passageways, and deposits of offerings buried beneath the earth. Some sanctuaries included small terracotta figures of women holding torches while descending staircases into subterranean rooms. These images likely represented initiates, symbolically entering Persephone's realm. The emotional atmosphere surrounding these rites was probably intense. Darkness, enclosed spaces, flickering torchlight, chanting, and silence would have created experiences designed to confront participants with fear directly. This was not accidental. Ancient mystery religions understood something psychologically profound. Transformation often requires descent into terror or uncertainty before renewal becomes possible. Persephone's myth embodied this principle perfectly. As queen of the underworld, Persephone also became increasingly connected to the dead themselves. Ancient curse tablets discovered across the Mediterranean frequently invoke Persephone alongside Hecate, Hades, Hermes, and spirits of the dead. These tablets, usually thin sheets of lead inscribed with prayers or curses, were buried in graves, wells, or underground chambers because practitioners believed messages placed beneath the earth reached underworld powers more effectively. Some curses requested justice against enemies. Others asked for love, revenge, protection, or punishment. What matters is that Persephone appears repeatedly as a divine authority capable of influencing hidden forces inaccessible to ordinary people. This association with magic became especially strong during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Magicians, astrologers, and practitioners of mystery cults increasingly viewed Persephone as a goddess possessing secret cosmic knowledge. She knew the paths souls traveled after death. She understood transitions between worlds. She ruled over spirits, dreams, and hidden truths. Certain magical papyri from Egypt even portray Persephone as terrifyingly powerful, describing her with titles emphasizing destruction, inevitability, and dominion over unseen realms. These texts often invoke her during rituals seeking access to supernatural wisdom or contact with the dead. The image of Persephone in these traditions differs dramatically from the vulnerable maiden of earlier myths. She becomes commanding. Ancient artistic representations evolved accordingly. Earlier Greek vase paintings often depict her as youthful and hesitant during the abduction scene. Later Hellenistic and Roman images increasingly portray her enthroned beside Hades with regal calm and authority. In some artworks, Persephone appears holding a scepter while receiving souls entering the underworld. In others, she stands beside Cerberus or supervises punishments within Tartarus. These depictions emphasize sovereignty rather than victimhood. One reason this transformation fascinated ancient audiences is because Persephone embodied a terrifying truth about existence itself. Innocence cannot survive unchanged after encountering death. The Korae who entered the underworld never fully returned. Each spring, Persephone rose again into sunlight, but she always remained permanently connected to darkness. She carried underworld knowledge back with her. Ancient religion treated this not as corruption, but as irreversible transformation. This made Persephone uniquely complex among Greek deities. Unlike purely benevolent fertility goddesses or purely destructive underworld powers, Persephone united opposites within herself. She represented life and death simultaneously, flowers and graves, birth and burial, youth and judgment. That duality gave her extraordinary symbolic power. It also explains why many ancient people believed Persephone possessed authority over madness, visions, and dreams. Dreams especially were considered dangerous because they blurred boundaries between worlds. During sleep, the mind entered hidden realms beyond conscious control. Some ancient texts suggest Persephone sent prophetic dreams or nightmares from the underworld. Temples connected to chthonic worship occasionally practiced incubation rituals where individuals slept within sacred underground chambers hoping to receive visions or messages from divine powers. This belief reinforced Persephone's role as mediator between visible and invisible realities. Her authority extended beyond ordinary mortality into cosmic inevitability itself. Even heroes feared her. When legendary figures such as Orpheus or Heracles entered the underworld, ancient stories emphasize not only danger from monsters or Hades, but the immense authority of Persephone herself. Permission from the queen often determined whether anyone could leave. In the myth of Orpheus, Persephone is deeply moved by his music and grief, helping persuade Hades to release Eurydice temporarily. Yet despite her sympathy, the laws of the underworld ultimately prevail. Once broken, those laws cannot easily be undone. This balance between compassion and inevitability became central to her identity. Persephone understood suffering because she had experienced it herself. But as Queen of the Dead, she also upheld cosmic order beyond personal emotion. That tension made her profoundly different from simpler divine archetypes. And as Greek civilization evolved through centuries of war, plague, political collapse, and philosophical questioning, Persephone's darker aspects became increasingly relevant. People living through uncertainty and mortality did not merely want comforting gods of sunlight and victory. They sought deities capable of confronting fear honestly. Persephone did exactly that. She ruled the place every human would eventually enter. She understood loss, transformation, and irreversible change. She embodied the terrifying realization that life cannot remain untouched forever. Yet she also represented continuity. Every year, she returned. Every spring, the flowers bloomed again. Every seed buried beneath the soil emerged transformed. This is why Persephone remained so enduring across ancient history. She was not simply goddess of death or goddess of spring. She was the living bridge between both realities, the reminder that destruction and renewal are inseparable parts of the same eternal cycle governing gods, nature, kingdoms, and humanity itself. As the centuries passed and the ancient world slowly disappeared beneath the weight of invasions, collapsing empires, religious transformation, and the rise of entirely new civilizations, the temples of Persephone gradually fell silent. Sacred fires that had burned for generations were extinguished. Priests vanished. Sanctuaries crumbled into ruins. The great processions to Eleusis ended. The voices that once carried hymns through torchlit nights faded into history. But Persephone herself never truly disappeared. That is the strange thing about certain myths. Some stories belong only to the civilization that created them. When that civilization dies, the stories die with it. Yet other myths survive because they are built around fears and truths so fundamental that every generation rediscovers them in different forms. Persephone became one of those myths. The ancient Greeks first imagined her as Kore, the maiden untouched by suffering, gathering flowers beneath endless spring skies. She represented innocence before transformation, life before loss, youth before knowledge of mortality. But the earth opened beneath her feet, and from that moment forward her story became something much larger than a single goddess. Because what happened to Persephone was what eventually happens to every civilization, every family, every human life. The descent always comes. Ancient audiences understood this instinctively. They lived in a world where death was visible constantly. Plagues swept through cities. Wars erased entire generations. Childbirth killed mothers. Famine entered village. Life expectancy was short, and survival itself felt uncertain. Unlike many modern societies that often hide death behind walls and institutions, the ancient world confronted mortality directly every day. That is why Persephone's mythology carried such enormous emotional force. She did not escape darkness completely. She did not defeat death permanently. Instead, she entered it, survived it, and emerged transformed. That distinction mattered deeply. The Greeks did not imagine existence as a simple battle between good and evil, where one side could eliminate the other forever. Their worldview was more tragic and more cyclical. Winter always followed summer. Crops required burial beneath the earth before growth could return. Every birth moved inevitably toward death. Persephone embodied this reality perfectly. She became queen not despite her suffering, but because of it. That transformation lies at the center of her mythology and explains why her story endured across thousands of years. The Kore who vanished into the underworld could never fully return unchanged. Once she crossed the boundary between worlds, innocence became impossible. But rather than being destroyed by that experience, she gained knowledge, authority, and power impossible for the untouched maiden she once was. This idea echoed throughout ancient religion, philosophy, and psychology long before modern thinkers gave it names. The descent changes you. Loss changes you. Knowledge changes you. And yet life continues. As ancient Greece evolved into the Roman world and later disappeared into medieval history, Persephone's myth kept resurfacing because humanity kept rediscovering the same terrifying truths. Every generation experiences moments when familiar reality breaks apart unexpectedly. Empires collapse, families fracture, illness arrives, loved ones disappear, entire worlds seem to descend underground. And in those moments, Persephone's story begins again. This is why the myth survived even after belief in the Olympian gods faded. Philosophers interpreted Persephone as the soul descending into material existence. Mystery cults treated her return as proof that death was not the end. Artists painted her abduction to capture beauty interrupted by catastrophe. Psychologists later viewed her journey as symbolic of trauma, transformation, and the hidden depths of the unconscious mind. But beneath every interpretation remained the same ancient structure. Descent, transformation, return. Even the natural world continued repeating her story endlessly. Every winter the earth still appears barren. Every spring flowers still emerge from beneath the soil. Seeds still disappear underground before returning transformed into life. The agricultural societies that first created Persephone's myth may be gone, but the cycles they observed still govern existence itself. Modern archaeology has uncovered the physical remains of her worship across the Mediterranean world. Excavators at Eleusis archaeological site uncovered initiation halls where thousands once gathered in darkness, awaiting revelation. In Sicily, sanctuaries dedicated to Demeter and Persephone still stand among ruined fields once believed to be the site of the abduction. Ancient curse tablets invoking Persephone have emerged from graves, wells, caves, and forgotten underground chambers. These discoveries remind us that Persephone was not merely literary imagination. Millions of real people feared her, prayed to her, mourned with her, and hoped through her. To them, she explained why life disappears and returns. She governed the invisible threshold separating the living from the dead. She carried the terrifying knowledge that everything beautiful is temporary, yet nothing truly vanishes forever. And perhaps that final paradox explains why her story still matters now. Persephone's myth never promises permanent escape from suffering. It does not claim darkness can be avoided. Instead, it insists that descent is part of existence itself, but also insists something equally important. Return is possible, not return to innocence, because innocence once lost can never fully come back. Persephone never again becomes only Kore, but return in another form. Return through transformation. Return carrying wisdom gained from darkness. The ancient Greeks understood this through seasons. The mystery cults understood it through initiation. Philosophers understood it through the soul. Modern humanity understands it through grief, trauma, survival, and change. Yet the structure remains the same. And so Persephone continued surviving long after her temples disappeared because she represents one of the deepest patterns humanity has ever recognized. The movement between worlds, the cycle of endings and beginnings, the truth that death exists inside life itself, the realization that growth often emerges from darkness rather than comfort, the understanding that what descends may rise again transformed. That is why her story never fully ends. Even now, thousands of years after ancient worshippers carried torches through sacred night processions in her honor, Persephone still lives in literature, art, psychology, philosophy, and memory. Her myth continues because every human life eventually reaches moments where the ground seems to open beneath familiar reality. And when that happens, the ancient story waits. A girl gathering flowers beneath the sunlight, a sudden fracture in the earth, a descent into darkness, and far below the surface of the world, beyond fear and grief and irreversible transformation, the slow beginning of another return.